Hi, I'm Jennifer Carter, and thank you for joining me on a podcast for parents, teachers, and administrators. Today's conversation should be a good one, and I'm sure it's something on your mind. So let's get to it. All right, so thank you, Myra, for joining me on the podcast. I like for people to put in their own words what they do and what their background is. So tell us a little bit about you and your connection to kids and everything.
All right. Thanks, Jen. So I'm Myra Garnes, and I live currently on Long Island. Jen and I know each other from college at Wittenberg University, so it's nice to reconnect. I have a background. I started working in higher ed administration and student affairs. So I worked on college campuses and then worked in independent schools as an administrator and diversity educator. And then, you know, God has this funny sense of humor and shook all of that up. And I was called to be a youth minister in the Episcopal Church. So I work on the bishop's staff as the canon for youth and young adult ministries in the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, and work with about 130 churches doing ministry with young people 6th through 12th grade, and then 18 to 30. So I really look at myself as a social justice educator, as a youth minister, as a person who really walks with young adults, young people, so that they can figure out, you know, what it is that God's calling them to do, and open those kind of opportunities and dreams up in their lives.
So it's interesting that you frame it in terms of social justice. How do you see the overlap of, you know, organized religion and social justice?
Well, for me, it's completely linked. And, you know, I've been working as a consultant with a project called Baptized for Life, which is a discipleship initiative through the Episcopal Church. And so we talk a lot about our baptism stories and really reclaiming this call, this invitation at baptism to back to what it is that we're doing, our Christian vocation. And I went to a Catholic school for 12 years, 2 different schools actually, but my sister, brother, and I got baptized the same year. I was in 4th grade. No, excuse me, I was in 6th grade. My sister was in 4th grade. My brother was in 8th grade. And we hadn't been baptized because we came from more of a Baptist family tradition, and would decide that. But it kept us on the margins in ways when it came to the faith and the worshiping experience in a Catholic school. So we were very connected outside of that, you know, good students, athletes, socially connected. But we had to sit in the pew when it was time to have communion or to be connected. So at one point we just said, we're ready to get baptized. And it was our choice. And all 3 of us were baptized at an Easter vigil. But, you know, as I look at it and reflect about it, and I talk to them about it as adults, it's a story of being left out in a way and to being kept on the margins. Interestingly enough, we were Black students in a very white community too. So it felt like there were, like those issues were linked, whether they were or not. In our youthful minds, there were ways that played into that story. And so part of my lens at justice is how do we have an invitation that everyone is welcome all the time, and all parts of us are welcome, and, you know, believing in a Jesus story that I walk with, that is what he gave us, right, and continues to give us. And so I say to young people that I work with in, you know, ministry, in church is this. It is all of this. It is opening up this wide door of doing justice, love, mercy, and walk humbly with God, you know, in a Micah 6:8 kind of a context. And so I don't have a way to separate that. I just think that it is us knowing what Jesus gave us. And if we're gonna say that, you know, I'm a Christian and I believe in that, then that is what we're called to do.
Well, it's so interesting that, you know, the Christianity that we see in the public eye doesn't look like the Christianity that you're describing. And you and I have probably similar experiences where our religious lives have been very much about equity issues, inclusion issues, making sure that poverty, that there's more parity in wealth distribution, and not in a, you know, social, you know, what a socialism type way, but just because if I have 7 cups of milk, I can't drink all of them today, so I'll give you 2, you know, almost like a practical, you know, you look at your abundance in practical terms, like how much do I need versus what do you need? But that's not always what we see when we hear about religion or when religion is discussed. That's why I'm a 100% advocate of separation of church and state, like to the point where I didn't even want to get married because I was like, not every person can get married. I would like to have a legal contract with you that says we are joined partners legally. But I was like, if we get married, we got to go to church for that, because I don't see them as the same. And my husband was like, we're getting married, come on. But that's very different, because so much religion is political or politicized. How do you help young people hear God versus hearing a politician? Because they're not the same. You know, that's like classic church and state from back. That's why the Pilgrims left, right? Because the king said, oh, I talk to God all the time. Here's what you guys are supposed to do. You know, how do you get young people to say, like, get themselves into a space away from social media and all that external noise so they can actually hear God and separate religion from everything, politics, for example?
Right. It is a muddy mess that I think we have as people co-opted, organized religion and in a variety of denominations that make it hard. I mean, I know I was a young person who stepped away for a while because I thought it wasn't that I didn't have a belief in God or that my faith was gone, but it was, I don't have time for this. Kind of bickering and nonsense, or spaces that say my LGBTQ sisters and brothers are not as welcome as I am, right? And it's funny you say that stuff about marriage. I think I was struggling too about what are the roles that we say that in my case, as a woman marrying a man, what is my now responsibility that the church is giving me? So I have a hard time with that, and watching some of those models. And I think young people are watching us, right? They're watching what we're doing. They're watching what we're saying, and feeling sometimes like there's hypocrisy. I think, one thing I've learned and am trying to pass along is sort of this notion, we talk about a rule of life, and giving young people, and that can start from such a young age, right? I have a friend who has twins, and trying to get them at 4 to do some meditation in silence, and figuring out how to self-soothe. Like we talk about that with babies early on, but it really is something that we have to keep building as children, as young people, as youth, and as adults. This idea of taking time for yourself to stop and think, to pray, or to talk to God, or to talk to what feels like your higher power, if you're not in a context that says, I really believe in God or understand that. Take some time for silence. I think taking time to move your body or to exercise. One thing we try to do is to like really connect with scriptures in a way, and biblical stories, right? So with children, I think too about how education should be this full-on experience. And I want, as much as you're teaching them, math, science, how can they be fully engaged in conversations? Like, do they understand a story about creation, about Noah and the ark, about Moses? Like, can they engage fully with their peers and then adults about just sort of historical context and what is it that we believe. So I think if we start to look at scriptures and have conversations about it and have wondering questions, like offer young people a chance to question and to hear our questions. I think sometimes as adults, we are afraid that we don't have the right answer, and to just own, I don't have that answer. And I don't know. Sometimes I don't understand what Jesus was saying in that story, but let's look it up. And, Google is always our friend to get, additional input about what a story is saying, what a gospel story is saying.
It's so funny because that's how I was raised in religion. I've been a ELCA Lutheran since I was 8 years old. My aunt took me to St. James Lutheran Church and on Hayden Avenue in East Cleveland. And I had a white pastor, and his wife was African-American, and the neighborhood was African-American. And he would always talk about that, like you said, that kind of, here's a story. What does this say about being different? What does this say about, and it was a poor neighborhood. What does this say about our obligation to poor people? Mm-hmm. We used to have, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, the height of the crack era. So we literally would have people who were high on crack or drunk stumble in the middle of the service, and they would just start, I remember one time, oh my God, my pastor used to do this to us all the time. This man came in and he was like, I hear what you're saying, but what do you know? And he was like, well, I'm teaching, from this scripture, blah, 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 blah. And he said, well, tell you what, listen to what I have to say. And then after I'm done, I'll listen to you. Jennifer, show them where we are and I was like, so I had to go and get this man and sit him down, and here's where we are in the program. Read this, sing this, stand up. And I, and anytime someone would come in, he would pick one of us to do this. And we didn't have a choice. But years later, when I talked to Pastor Gahagan, and I remind him of these things, what it taught was I didn't have the right to be pissed off that man smelled bad or to be high. That is for him and God to have a conversation about. He's another person who came into our home, our church home, and I have to be a gracious host. And years later, that's what I took away from that is, how do you invite someone in so they can have their conversation with God, Mm-hmm. And when at our school, at Oak Tree, both in San Bernardino and Los Angeles, we teach our kids, they're not religious schools, but they are schools with that in mind. When people come into our space, how can we be gracious? How can we extend mercy and grace to them? I don't call it that because, like I said, it's inclusive. Anybody can come to the school, but that's really what it's about. Mm-hmm. And I think that piece about meditating and that pause is, you don't then get to say, well, I'm not friends with that person, or you don't get to say, well, that person's not like me. You pause and you're like, oh, I got to be gracious. And then you lead with that, which I think that's like the spiritual gift that we're talking about and extending to people. I feel like it's hard for people who haven't experienced church like we have to understand that's why we have the faith we have, mm-hmm. because they've had experiences that are so much different than that. How do you bridge that? How do you help people who may have had an experience that says some people are bad, and then reconcile it with what we say is exactly the opposite, which is, because they're bad, maybe that's how you extend grace to them. Like, how do you do that, with both the kids and the adults, because their parents ultimately have to buy into this malarkey too. Yeah. Hey there. If you've gotten this far into the episode, chances are that you really like what you're listening. I'm going to ask you to press pause and share this particular episode with 5 people that you think would really enjoy listening to it. I'm also going to ask that you subscribe to our podcast so that you don't miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get back to the conversation.
I think it's this notion of, we would say something like seeing the face of God in others, or seeing this notion of love. Like, right, so if I don't have a picture of what God looks like or this faith, I think it is, your story is that, being a child in a church welcoming anyone, or it is, how do I see myself in other people? How can I see what is beloved and beautiful in other people?
Mm-hmm.
And then, welcome them fully, right? And also, share something special that I have, and then try to receive something from them. If it's just that if we don't allow ourselves, or we don't allow our children the opportunity to reach out and connect to other people, we'll continue to be in these, sort of isolated communities, these isolated connections with folks who are maybe just like us, or, it doesn't help elevate them to a place where they are sharing and receiving. We don't know what we will receive unless we put ourselves in a place to connect. I often ask kids about, experiencing, like, take walks around your community. We sometimes call it a prayer walk, but you don't have to call it that. You could, just think of it as an experiential walk where you're noticing people, you're noticing nature, you're noticing what are the buildings, what's the architecture like, what is happening here? And then sometimes adventuring, with your children to another community to see and witness what's different about this community compared to ours. And sometimes when we're doing, say, a prayer walk, it might be that you do say a little prayer or give some positive thoughts or energy toward what it is that you're witnessing, or something that you would hope that would change, or to be different. I also think, sometimes it's, as parents, like now the beautiful thing is we're in this virtual world, and how do we find, so you could go to church anywhere if you wanted to. Like, say you have this notion that I don't know what to do. How do we even enter in? This hasn't been my background, or it's been so long, I feel embarrassed. So you don't have to even be embarrassed. Like, we can just pop into any church space or kind of worship space across the country. And oftentimes they're offering sort of like Sunday school or things like that. And listen, right? Or there are, many websites that are offering sort of faith at home opportunities where I do think that it is this interdenominational, that helps, right? When adults are able to risk enough to share what it is that we're feeling and experiencing, and what does it mean, our children get to process that with us. Also another opportunity might be thinking about, Vacation Bible School, VBS. So there are people who do this in the summer, right? You don't have to necessarily be a member of that church or that faith tradition. And they offer in community, in the neighborhood, a chance for children to be together and maybe share biblical stories and experiences and activities throughout the course of a week. A lot of those have moved online too, because the notion of the pandemic. But I think having children look at, each day, maybe even asking questions like, where did you experience something good? What was something challenging today? As you're processing through your meal or your drive or your bedtime connection, before the story or after the story, or before you say goodnight, it is, you may frame it in, where did you see something that brought you joy? Where did you see God? Where was something that made you feel sad or disappointed? Was there something that you wanted to change about something that happened today? And so it may be that it is, really sort of God specific or faith specific, or something connected to a Jesus story, if you have that, or, your tradition is, as a Muslim or as a Jewish person or as a Buddhist, but it also can be that we're just inviting our children into an awareness that is outside of themselves and focused on others.
And so what you're really saying is framing, whether it's spirituality or even something that's more agnostic, it's still about the connection, and it's still about the reflection on how we connect.
Yes.
And it's interesting that you talk about questioning. I had a very conservative teacher, religion teacher in high school, and he always said, faith is not real faith unless you question it and doubt it, because that's what it is. You don't know if this is real, and you have to always question it. And I like the idea of questioning without being self-conscious about it, without letting that question and doubt. And just because you have questions, then you're not a believer. Just because you have questions, you are a believer. That whole idea of questioning for reflection is universal. It doesn't have to be attached to a particular religion. Right. And it's so funny that we talk about meditation and mindfulness, because those are tenets that are very much part of that questioning and praying. So again, whether you're a religious person or a person that doesn't have a faith background, you still are connected, because you still use the same fundamental tools to get to that part of you where there is something to explore, to bring out the best in you and to connect with other people.
Yeah.
It's my job as an early childhood educator and, elementary educator is easier, believe it or not, because we actually do focus on social and emotional growth with children. But the irony is, the older kids get and the more they need that, the less it's taught intentionally and even assessed.
Yes. Yeah.
By the time you graduate from high school and there's cliques and choices about drugs and sex and who knows what other, social and emotional training has long since stopped, and that's what you need in most. But I think having someone like you, where you get to explore that, but just in a different name, I think helps people, again, reflect differently so that they move in the world differently,
Mm-hmm. And I think we have to, as adults, not be afraid to, ask the questions and let whatever comes out, right? And particularly as young people get older, if there's not a safe space to explore the confusion and all of the messaging that's coming at them, we're doing them a disservice, and we're being naive. And there's so much access to information that we didn't have, and how do we walk with them and support them if we're not prepared, or we don't find partners, right? So maybe if, as a parent, I said, I can't take this, I can't have this conversation, but who is that auntie, uncle, beloved friend who can handle it with you and support you? I just called a friend the other day and I said, sweetheart, I need you to look at your daughter's social media. And she said, uh-oh. And I said, yeah, I think we're okay, but I need her parents need to pay attention to this right now. And that's part of the beauty of it, is that it's not, we can't do it alone. We can't, chastise a child. We can't, but if we walk together, so her auntie friend here, Miss Myra, noticed some things. And so I'm just trying to help, support the parents, and figure out where we can, talk about different things that need to be talked about. So I was thinking of something else too, and I've kind of drawn a blank, but I think experiences. Oh, I know. I was thinking about justice. We were talking about this notion of justice and how the church has really walked in justice movements. I think that's where we kind of get confused right now about this story that happens too. One thing that I was doing in a retreat with high school students the last few years was we've explored, because it's the Episcopal Church, justice movements that the church has been involved in, from the ordination of women to slavery or Jim Crow or rights for LGBTQ folks or women. And so having young people do some of the research and activism, right now, Dr. Gates is doing a series on the Black church on PBS. Right. And so looking at how the Black church was so heavily linked to what happened in the civil rights movement and the shifts, there was a place to organize. And so I do think that, there has been a way that the church has abused and hurt and harmed people. Let's not play games. Like we know those stories too, but I do think that there are ways that we can let's look at both sides of where there has been positive growth and change from a belief that all of God's children are beloved, that we all are beloved and we all deserve the best things.
I mean, I look at the controversies in the church as, those are humans, and humans, that's the fullness of human nature and humanity. How you react to that, how you deal with that, that's the conversation with God, because God is not of that. That's separate. Just because somebody is acting up in their church doesn't mean that God is acting up, And like you said, there's so many examples of Buddhists and Christians and Jews and Muslims all fighting to make sure that at the core that other people are safe, physically, mentally, psychologically safe. That's really what you're talking about. When you look at Gandhi, he wanted people to be safe. When you look at Martin Luther King, he wanted people to be safe. When you look at Joan of Arc, you can go through the gamut. And so helping young people, like you said, look at that history and see how organization, whether it's religious or, Black Lives Matter or, national organization, or whatever your organization is, but that idea of organization for social justice, there's a lot of examples in the church that are a blueprint for how to do this and have an impact, even without social media, So I think it's a great resource, and it sounds like you're doing fantastic work. Those kids are so lucky to have you.
Thanks, Jen. You're so sweet. Yeah, I'm lucky to have them. I think that we look at movements that young people are doing now. March for Our Lives. Look how these young people have shifted what our take and our view on gun violence and what needs to happen legislatively, the climate justice work that young people are doing, Black Lives Matter. We've got to get out of the way and help create space for them to shift. That's what we've seen, right? We've seen young people make movement, create movements that have affected all the change in this country. And so I think if we help them look at themselves in a lens that says, you know what, I'm going to make space for other folks. We're going to walk hand in hand and get some stuff done and use our brilliant thinking and connect with, adults that can help support that. Change is bound to happen. So I'm going to stay in it. I'm sorry.
I said positive change.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for having this conversation with me. I think it's super important. Faith is a huge part of my life. It is the reason I got myself into this whole preschool world. God was like, go ahead. And I was like, and it's nice to be able to have a conversation with somebody who gets that, So
yeah, I'll be praying for Learning Tree and you and Mrs.C and all of your families. And so it's amazing work that you're doing. I'm proud. I'm honored to be with you to talk about this.
Excellent. So that's our conversation for today. I hope you found some information that was interesting or a perspective that you hadn't thought of. If you like what you heard, or even if you have some feedback, put a comment in our comment section. Be sure to like our page and make sure that you subscribe so that you can hear when the next video comes out. Thanks so much again for joining us.